The screen flickers to life, a soft hum, dance of shadows. It's the early 1940s. The world is at war, but inside movie theaters, time stands still. The smell of popcorn drifts through velvet curtains as projectors beam silver light onto wide-eyed audiences. Humphrey Bogart's cigarette glows like a beacon in the dark. Judy Garland's trembling smile offers comfort. Gene Tierney's eyes promise mystery. For millions, these faces were more than actors. They were companions, escape routes, and hope itself. In the middle of fear, rationing, and loss, they gave people something to believe in, the illusion of forever. But behind that silver glow, Hollywood was a kingdom with invisible walls. It was a dream factory that could make anyone immortal, or erase them overnight. One day, a star's name would shine brighter than any marquee in America. The next, it would vanish without explanation. Their faces disappeared from posters. Their fan mail stopped. Their contracts were quietly torn apart. Some people said they quit. Others whispered about scandal. But the truth was more complex and far more tragic. The 1940s glittered with promises, yet it was an era built on control. To be a movie star then was to live under a microscope. Every smile, every friendship, every love affair was calculated by the studios. MGM, Warner Bros., Paramount. These weren't just companies. They were empires. And their actors? They were property. The studios owned everything. Your image, your voice, your name, and sometimes even your silence. If the studio wanted to make you a goddess, they could. But if you disobeyed, complained, or simply grew tired, they could take it all back. And that's why so many 1942nd stars disappeared not from choice, but from power. Take Gene Tierney, for instance. In 1945, she was the definition of elegance. Audiences adored her haunting performance in Laura. Men wrote her letters declaring their undying love. Women copied her style, but behind that perfect image was a woman quietly falling apart. She suffered from depression long before Hollywood knew how to talk about mental health. When tragedy struck her family, a heartbreak that would haunt her for life, the studio didn't offer comfort. They offered silence. Her pain was bad for business. By the early 1950s, she was gone from the spotlight, another beautiful ghost of the 1940s. Then there was Veronica Lake, the woman with the peekaboo hairstyle that defined wartime glamour. She was tiny, witty, and utterly unforgettable. For a few years, she was everywhere, in magazines, newsreels, and the dreams of every soldier overseas. But when the war ended and hairstyles changed, the studio turned its back. One moment, she was Hollywood's hottest star. The next, she was struggling for work, later serving tables in a small diner. The newspapers that once praised her now mocked her downfall. Fame in the 1940s was never owned, it was rented. And when the rent came due, few could afford to pay. The real power in Hollywood back then rested in the hands of a few men, the studio heads. Louis B. Mayer, Jack Warner, Darrell F. Zanuck. They controlled careers like puppet masters. They could build a legend overnight or destroy one before lunch. Stars signed contracts that seemed like dreams, but were really chains. If you wanted a raise, they suspended you. If you wanted to choose your own roles, they loaned you to a rival studio as punishment. If you wanted to marry, you needed permission. They even controlled your public image. If you gained weight, they sent you to health farms. If you aged, they sent you for rejuvenation. And if you fell in love with the wrong person, they rewrote your story. It's easy to look back now and see the glamour, the gowns, the limousines, the premieres. But behind those glittering surfaces were frightened young men and women, barely in their 20s, doing everything they could to stay relevant. Some turned to pills to stay thin, others to alcohol to sleep. The pressure was immense. Every headline, every photograph, every fan letter carried the weight of an empire. And the moment that weight cracked you, the studio simply replaced you. That's why the 1940s were full of shooting stars, dazzling, short-lived, and destined to burn out too soon. The war added another layer of fragility. Many stars went overseas to entertain troops, while others joined the military themselves. Some came back heroes, but others came back changed, haunted, lost. Unable to fit into Hollywood's glossy mold, the world they returned to had moved on. Their contracts expired. Their names no longer drew crowds. A few tried to reinvent themselves, but Hollywood rarely forgave time. It worshipped youth and novelty. Yesterday's idol was today's nobody. The audience never saw the pain, only the perfection. Publicists worked overtime to craft fairy tales. If a star vanished, the studio would say they were on vacation or pursuing new opportunities. But in truth, many were quietly let go, their phone calls unanswered, their photos removed from studio lobbies. Some moved to radio or theater. Others simply disappeared from public life, their names fading from memory like old film reels left to decay. And yet, what made the system so tragic is that these stars truly loved their craft. They weren't in it for money. There wasn't much compared to today. They did it for the magic, for the chance to make audiences laugh, cry, dream. They gave everything: their youth, their privacy, their sanity. And in return, Hollywood gave them a few glittering years before throwing them aside. The irony is that while the 1940s looked like a golden decade for film, it was also a time when freedom was nearly impossible. Everything was scripted. Not just the movies, but life itself. If an actress became pregnant out of wedlock, the studio arranged a vacation or a secret adoption. If an actor was suspected of being gay, they were given fake relationships to protect the brand. If a star struggled with mental health, they were sent to rest homes until they could smile again. And if they refused to smile, they were gone. Hollywood was a dream, yes, but a controlled dream, built on fear and obedience. The very thing that made those stars shine, their individuality. Their charisma was the thing the system tried hardest to suppress. And once they stopped fitting the mold, they vanished, almost as if the camera itself refused to remember them. By the late 1940s, change was coming. The studio system began to crack. The war was over, television was rising, and audiences wanted something real. But for many of those shining faces, it was already too late. The industry that had built them now had no place for them. Their stories ended not with applause, but with silence, a silence that still lingers. When we watch those old films today and wonder, whatever happened to her? Whatever happened to him? For every Bogart and Garland who endured, there were dozens more who didn't. Stars like Gail Russell, whose beauty was only matched by her shyness, drank herself to death trying to cope with Hollywood's expectations. Or Laird Krieger, a talented character actor who died at 31 after a dangerous crash. Diet to meet studio demands. These weren't failures of talent, they were casualties of a cruel system. And that's the hidden tragedy of 1940 Seconds Hollywood. It wasn't that stars lost their way. It was that the dream factory they trusted turned them into illusions. And illusions, no matter how bright, were never meant to last. The year was 1949. The glow of victory from World War II still shimmered in America's heart. But beneath that celebration, something else was changing, something quiet, dangerous, and irreversible. Hollywood's golden dream was cracking. The faces that once defined glamour, Lana Turner, Rita Hayworth, Veronica Lake, Tyrone Power, and so many more, were beginning to disappear, one by one. To the public, it seemed like coincidence. To those inside the system, it felt like a storm that had been waiting for years to break. The war had changed everything. Before, audiences wanted escape musicals, love stories, laughter. But now, they wanted truth. The soldiers who returned from Europe and the Pacific weren't interested in fairy tales anymore. They had seen too much. The world was no longer black and white, and neither were the movies. But the studios didn't know how to change. They kept pushing the same glamorous fantasies, using the same tired stars, until the audience simply stopped believing. And so, the unthinkable happened. The stars who once seemed untouchable began to fade. Their contracts ended, their box office numbers dropped, and suddenly, they were gone. To outsiders, it looked like they'd lost their magic. But inside Hollywood, whispers told another story of fear, control, and betrayal. The first tremor came with the House Un-American Activities Committee (HUAC) in 1947. Washington turned its gaze toward Hollywood. searching for supposed communists in the film industry. For many stars, this was the beginning of the end. Being accused or even rumored was enough to destroy a career overnight. Writers, directors, and actors who had once been beloved were suddenly branded as traitors. Some fled the country, others changed their names. Many never worked again. For audiences, it was shocking. How could their heroes, the same people who made them laugh and cry, be treated like criminals? But the studios didn't care about justice. They cared about survival. Anyone who looked like a risk was quietly let go. Careers vanished in days. And what made it even sadder was that some of the accused weren't even guilty, just unlucky enough to have spoken out or befriended the wrong person. The blacklist didn't just silence politics, it silenced humanity. It made stars terrified to speak their minds, to take roles that might seem controversial. Many chose to disappear rather than live under suspicion. Some drank, some moved to Europe, others simply lost hope. The dream factory had turned into a cold machine, and the people who once brought light to millions were now shadows in their own world. At the same time, a new threat emerged: television. In 1947, only a few thousand homes had TVs. By the early 1950s, millions did. Audiences no longer needed to leave their homes for entertainment. The magic of the cinema, the velvet seats, the grand curtains, the smell of popcorn began to lose its hold. And as theater attendance dropped, so did the demand for movie stars. For the studios, television was an enemy they didn't understand. For the stars, it was a thief. One day, their faces filled screens 40 feet tall. The next, they were replaced by smiling strangers in living rooms. And because many of those film stars were under rigid contracts, they couldn't adapt. They couldn't make the jump to TV, not without permission. Some tried, but the studio head saw television as beneath cinema and forbade it. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The audience had moved on. This shift was brutal, especially for female stars. Hollywood had always worshipped youth, and now, with new faces appearing every week on TV, aging actresses were treated like relics. The cruel irony? These were women who had once built the entire industry's image of beauty and grace. Now, they were invisible. Actresses like Dorothy Lamour, once the queen of exotic adventure films, found herself unemployed. Hedy Lamarr, one of the most intelligent and striking women in Hollywood, faded into obscurity despite co-inventing technology that would one day lead to Wi-Fi. And then there were the personal battles, the ones that didn't make the headlines until it was too late. Judy Garland, whose voice had carried America through war and worry, was now fighting her own body. Years of studio-enforced dieting, pills, and exhaustion had taken their toll. MGM had given her fame but stolen her childhood. By the late 1940s, she was spiraling: canceled concerts, hospitalizations, heartbreak. And when she faltered, the studio didn't help. They replaced her. The same girl who had once made the world believe in rainbows was suddenly too unreliable to hire. This was the real cost of the system, the slow, quiet destruction of human beings disguised as careers. Even the biggest male stars weren't immune. Tyrone Power, the dashing romantic lead of the 1940s, felt trapped by the very image that made him famous. He wanted deeper roles, more meaning, but the studio wouldn't let him break free. When he did, it was already too late. Exhausted from years of pressure, he collapsed during filming and died at just 44. His death stunned Hollywood, yet it was only one of many that decade. The tragedy was that Hollywood didn't just discard its stars, it erased their legacy. Once a contract ended, the studio stopped promoting their films, stopped reprinting their photos, stopped mentioning their names. For the next generation of audiences, these once golden idols became strangers. Their movies gathered dust in archives, their faces fading into memory. And yet, if you look closely, their shadows are still everywhere. Every modern star owes a debt to those vanished faces, the ones who walked so others could run. The glamour we still associate with old Hollywood was built by those people. The perfection we imagine, the gowns, the poses, the smiles, came at the price of real human suffering. By the end of the 1940s, Even the tone of cinema had changed. Gone were the musicals and idealized romances. In their place came film noir, dark, moody stories filled with broken men and doomed women. These films weren't just fiction, they were reflections of a disillusioned industry. The shadows on screen mirrored the shadows behind it. The glamorous blonde femme fatales, the cynical detectives, they were Hollywood's subconscious, mourning its own lost innocence. It was as if the city itself had grown tired of pretending. Behind every glittering premiere was a bankruptcy. Behind every smile was heartbreak. The golden age had created too many ghosts, and now they haunted every frame. In the years that followed, a few tried to reclaim their light. Some found second lives on television or the stage. Others reinvented themselves in Europe, where they were treated with respect rather than as commodities. But for most, the silence never ended. Their names faded from gossip columns, replaced by new ones. Brando, Monroe, Dean. The new generation had arrived, and Hollywood had moved on. What made it all so heartbreaking was that the public never knew what had truly happened to the world. The 1940s were a time of magic, a time when the stars never dimmed. But behind the curtains, it was an empire built on control, fear, and the illusion of perfection. Those who couldn't maintain that illusion were quietly removed. Their films remained, but their names were erased from history books. And so, when people today look back and ask, why did so many stars vanish overnight? The answer is simple and cruel. Because Hollywood wanted them to. Because fame, in that golden decade, was never about talent or loyalty. It was about power. As the 1950s dawned, that power began to crumble. The studio system was dying. Television had won. Audiences were changing. But before it all collapsed, there was one last act, a reckoning that would expose the deepest secrets of the industry and remind the world that even the brightest stars can be consumed by the very light that made them shine. By the dawn of the 1950s, Hollywood was a kingdom in ruins. The great studio gates still stood tall: MGM, Warner Bros., Paramount, but behind them, the empire was crumbling. The glamour was fading, the money was shrinking, and the illusion of control that once ruled every star's life was slipping away. The dream factory had grown too large, too proud, too blind to see that the world outside had changed. The war had transformed audiences. They were no longer wide-eyed romantics hungry for fantasy. They were real people who had lived through loss and chaos. They didn't want fairy tales. They wanted truth. And so, the stories that once made stars immortal now felt artificial. The stars who had been trained to smile on command, who spoke from carefully written scripts and lived by studio rules, no longer connected. The audience could feel the emptiness behind the perfection. The first major blow came from within. The studio system, that rigid machine that owned actors like property, began to face legal challenges. The Supreme Court ruled in 1948 that studios could no longer own theaters. Suddenly, the major companies that had controlled everything from production to screening lost their monopoly. Without guaranteed audiences, profits plummeted. Contracts were torn apart. Thousands of employees, including actors, were released. Overnight, a system that had seemed invincible began to collapse. And when the machine fell, it crushed many of the people it once protected. Stars who had depended on studio, publicity, and promotion suddenly found themselves alone. The publicists were gone. The fan clubs dissolved. The photographers stopped calling. Without the studio's machinery behind them, many stars didn't know how to survive. They weren't trained for independence, only obedience. Some tried to adapt. They took smaller roles, worked in television, or moved to Europe, where audiences still loved that old Hollywood charm. But for many, it was too late. Years of typecasting and control had stripped them of flexibility. They couldn't reinvent themselves. They were trapped in images that no longer fit the times. The 1950s brought a new kind of star: raw, rebellious, unfiltered. Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Marilyn Monroe represented something the 1940s never allowed: imperfection. They were emotional, unpredictable, human. They didn't need to be flawless. They needed to be real. For audiences, this was thrilling, but for the surviving 1,942nd stars, it was devastating. They had been taught to hide their humanity, not embrace it. The very thing they were punished for, emotion, was now being celebrated. Imagine being a 1,940 goddess like Lana Turner or Joan Crawford, watching as new faces took over the screen. Imagine realizing that everything you were told to be graceful, composed, obedient no longer mattered. The world no longer wanted icons. It wanted rebels. For many stars, that realization was unbearable. Some fought back. Crawford reinvented herself in the 1950s as a horror icon, clinging to the spotlight with sheer willpower. Others, like Rita Hayworth, withdrew into silence. Once the most desired woman in the world, she spent her later years battling Alzheimer's, forgotten by the very industry that had worshipped her beauty. The tragedy of Rita's story was that she never belonged to herself. Columbia Pictures had even changed her name and erased her Spanish heritage to make her marketable. When the studio system died, there was nothing left for her to fall back on, not even her own identity. And yet, even amid the heartbreak, something beautiful happened. Out of the ashes of that old, oppressive system came a new kind of art. Filmmakers began experimenting. Independent studios emerged. Actors could finally choose their roles, speak their truths, and live as human beings, not products. The death of the 1940s Dream Factory gave birth to a more honest Hollywood, one where individuality mattered more than control. But for those who had lived through the golden cage, freedom came too late. Many of them never found peace. Alcohol, depression, and loneliness haunted the stars who had once been worshipped. They had spent their lives pretending to be perfect, pretending to be happy, pretending to be immortal. When the pretending ended, they didn't know who they were. One of the most heartbreaking examples was Jean Tierney. In her later years, she found some measure of peace away from Hollywood, working in a department store, far from cameras. When fans recognized her, she would smile politely, a faint echo of the woman who had once defined beauty. But behind that smile was acceptance. She had survived. That, in itself, was victory. Another tragic story was Veronica Lake. After disappearing from the screen, she struggled with poverty and alcoholism. In the 1970s, she briefly reappeared in interviews, candidly admitting that fame had been a curse as much as a gift. "Hollywood destroyed more people than it made," she once said quietly, "and it doesn't even remember their names." Her words carried the truth of an entire generation. And then there were the forgotten men, the handsome leading actors whose names had once filled marquees. Robert Taylor, Alan Ladd, Glenn Ford. Some adjusted, others faded quietly into character roles or retired early. Hollywood had always been crueler to women, but it had no mercy for anyone who stopped selling tickets. By the time the 1960s arrived, the stars of the 1940s had become legends in black and white. Their faces lived on in late-night reruns and dusty posters. To a new generation, they were distant myths, glamorous ghosts from a simpler time. But for those who remembered, their stories carried weight. They were the pioneers, the ones who built the dream, even if it consumed them. What happened to those vanished stars wasn't just Hollywood's fault, it was part of a larger truth about fame itself. Fame is a fragile illusion. It feels eternal, but it's built on attention, and attention moves fast. One moment, the world loves you. The next, it forgets you. And for those 1,942nd stars, there was no social media, no second act, no comeback tour. When the phone stopped ringing, it was over. Yet, somehow, they never truly disappeared. Every time a classic film plays, every time someone hears Judy Garland's voice or watches Bogart's smirk, they come alive again. The magic of film, the thing that destroyed them, also made them immortal. That's the paradox of Hollywood. It can erase you from life, but never from memory. In a strange way, their stories serve as warnings and blessings to every generation of performers who came after. They remind us that behind the lights, the fame, and the applause, there are real people. People who loved, hurt, aged, and longed to be seen, just as stars but as souls. The 1940s were a time of impossible beauty, but also of impossible expectations. As the final credits of that era rolled, Hollywood transformed forever. The rigid contracts disappeared. Stars gained control of their careers. Independent studios and agents took power from the old moguls. The dream factory became an industry of choice rather than chains. But the cost of that freedom was written in the stories of those who came before, those who vanished so others could shine. When we watch their films today, the flickering black and white images, the soft orchestral music, the laughter, the longing, we're not just watching entertainment. We're witnessing ghosts. Each frame is a fragment of someone's real life, captured forever. A moment when they believed the dream would last forever, and perhaps, in a way, did. Because though their careers ended, though their names may have faded from modern headlines, their light still burns. It lives in every old theater that still shows classic films. It lives in every tear shed by someone watching Casablanca or The Wizard of Oz for the first time. It lives in the simple, timeless magic of a movie screen. So, why did so many 1942nd stars vanish overnight? The answer is that they didn't vanish at all. They were taken by a system that built them up and tore them down, by a world that changed faster than they could, by a dream that was never meant to last. But though the world forgot their names, the light they left behind never went out. It's still flickering somewhere. Every time we close our eyes and remember that once, under a glowing marquee and a sky full of searchlights, Hollywood was heaven, and they were the stars that made it shine.